You taller people may be seated. Good morning, boys and girls. Let's try that one more time. It's too pretty a morning. We got to get excited. Good morning, boys and girls. Yes, I'll take that. Okay, I got a question for you. And my daughter, Aoife, is not allowed to answer this question, so you can't answer it. Have any of you guys ever gone somewhere with your parents or your grandparents or your aunt and uncles or your friend, and you've been driving someplace on the road? They told you they knew where they were going, but they got turned around and got lost. Have you ever been riding with some of your parents to do that? Would that, you're not allowed to raise your hand, Aoife. What happens? Do they get a little upset by that sometimes? Do you ever look at them and say, why did you not put it on Google Maps and look it up? You ask them that sometimes. They get turned around, they don't know where they're going. Has that happened to you before? And then you found your way, right? I mean, it takes a little time, you get turned around, and you find your way, right? That's how it goes sometimes. Well, you know what? All of these people out here can get turned around driving on the road, but all of us can get turned around in our lives too. Sometimes we think we know where we're going and we go to the wrong place. Sometimes we need somebody to help us. And guess what? A lot of these people are afraid to stop and ask for help. Did you know that? Maybe I'm afraid to stop and ask for help sometimes too. But there's somebody who is always there to help us when we get turned around when we're in our lives. This person that we know of doesn't drive a whole lot in a vehicle or a car, but he walks with us a lot. You know, when we get turned around, he walks next to us. Who do you think that person is? Jesus, that's right. Jesus, God through Jesus can help all of these people find their way. And today there's a story about some people that are walking in the wrong direction. Did you know that? You know how the Bible says they're walking in the wrong direction? Because it says they're walking away from Jerusalem. Jerusalem's pretty important in the Bible. Jesus has spent his whole time going to Jerusalem, and all of a sudden there's these two people that love Jesus who are leaving and walking away from Jerusalem. And guess who suddenly shows up there walking with them? Jesus. That's right, they don't recognize him. And you know what? When they finally do recognize him, and they recognize him when he breaks bread, you know what they want to do immediately? Get back on the road and go in the right direction. And guess where the right direction is? Back toward Jerusalem. That's right. So Jesus is sort of like the beginner of Google Maps of the Spirit, right? If we just would give it all to Jesus, he would give us directions, and that's because he loves us. So look out at all these people out here because they need to hear this message this morning. It's been a beautiful weekend, and now we got to go through more cold weather again for a short amount of time. Look out at all of them and tell them on the count of 3 who it is who loves them, and say it really loud, okay? Jesus, remember? On the count of 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Jesus! That's right. Good job, guys. Well, good morning. Around 16 or 17 years ago, honestly, just after I'd finished my first year of seminary, I was incredibly blessed to receive a generous fellowship from the Lilly Foundation that allowed me to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. As hard as it is for many of us today to afford it, and even harder for us sometimes to be brave enough to go, I still strongly feel that every Christian should do whatever they can to someday make their own pilgrimage to the Holy Land. To actually be able to stand in the very places where Jesus once stood, and to hear again passages of Scripture in the very locations where they occurred can be a life-changing experience for every person of faith. For me, it was definitely that and a whole lot more. And I continue to count my visit and pilgrimage to the Holy Land as one of the most important events that ever happened in my life. My pilgrimage in Israel and Palestine was based out of St. George's Anglican Cathedral and College in Jerusalem, in which I was able to study and learn as I traveled around the country through St. George's excellent program called the Palestine of Jesus. At the very end of my pilgrimage, after over 2 weeks of walking the Via Dolorosa in the old city of Jerusalem, spending time in the desert at the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and the ancient Masada, and traveling north to Nazareth and to the Galilee, I found myself at the very end with a group of pilgrims on a bus heading just a few miles west out of the city of Jerusalem. As we traveled on the major motorway and began to take the familiar route that leads down towards what's known as the coastal plain in Israel, our bus suddenly took an unexpected turn and began to wind its way up tiny roads between houses and shops in a small Israeli village. Not too far up the road, the bus finally pulled over, and we were all then ushered out by our wonderful Palestinian Christian guide, a short distance down the road to what looked like to us was simply a dead end. It was there that the asphalt quickly turned into gravel before it gave way a little more into dirt and brush on a thorny path. We walked in silence together for a time beside an empty stream until suddenly we came to a stop at what appeared to be an excavated archaeological site. There, exposed beneath the dust and the dirt, was smooth stones stacked on top of each other and spread out like an ancient highway, which we soon found out was exactly what they were there to be. As we stood quietly observing, our guide took out his Bible, and he began reading for us the same passage from the Gospel of Luke you and I just heard read again here in this church on the third Sunday in the great 50 days of Easter. We were standing next to what had indeed been an ancient Roman road built just before the time of Jesus, what was most likely the only archaeological evidence that remains of the ancient road to Emmaus. But there was an immediate problem to which many of us were already aware of. Even though we were standing on an ancient Roman road that once ran westward out of Jerusalem, no one has ever really been able to locate an actual village that had once been known as Emmaus anywhere in first century Israel. Unlike Bethlehem, Jericho, Nazareth, and even Capernaum, scholars and archaeologists have found no other historical reference to an Emmaus outside of the gospel story in the New Testament we just heard this morning. There have been numerous theories as to which Jewish community may have once been the village known as Emmaus. Some locations, like the ancient village of Emmaus, which was the favored site for the early church historians like Eusebius and Jerome, were chosen because they had similar sounding names, while others, like the modern village of Abu Ghosh, which is where the 12th century Crusaders placed Emmaus, seem to fit the New Testament's description only because of how far the biblical Emmaus is said to have been located from Jerusalem in Luke's gospel. That was around 7 miles, or if you read your King James version of the Bible, 80 furlongs. But when it comes right down to it, no one has ever really discovered where the town of Emmaus in the time of Jesus ever existed. So for modern-day pilgrims like myself, that tiny, dusty piece of ancient Roman road outside of Jerusalem is probably as close as we will ever get to discovering an actual road that might have led to an Emmaus. Still, for me, standing on a 2,000-year-old Roman highway was all I needed that day to feel myself being a part of one of my favorite stories from the Easter experience. And as I stood there all those years ago, imagining in my mind Cleopas and the other disciple walking there together with Jesus on those ancient stones, I had no doubt that I was, in that moment, standing within a thin place between the spiritual and the physical planes. And brothers and sisters, as we hear again the Emmaus story this morning, it is my sincere prayer that this important and amazing story might still be able to take you, if you will let it, to one of those thin places in your own walk with Jesus today as well. Because really, there is no other moment in the Gospels where the resurrected Jesus of then and the resurrected Jesus of now come together so perfectly and intertwined across the ages. For just as much as those ancient stones on that ancient road once held the very weight of God upon them, as people of faith in the here and now, whether we realize it or not, we too continue to walk on our own Emmaus roads and encounter the heavy grace and love of the same God in the risen Jesus as well. In the Gospel of Luke this morning, we hear again that wonderful story of two disciples walking away from Jerusalem on their way home after the tragedy of Good Friday. They have been stunned by the gruesome execution they'd witnessed just 3 days prior, and they have been shaken by news now that Jesus' body is missing from the tomb in which it was laid. And though the Bible doesn't say it, if we close our eyes and think about it, we can almost see Cleopas and the other disciple, who could very well have been his wife, walking with their heads hung low in defeat, completely distraught and heartbroken for the loss of their beloved Lord and Rabbi. They are so upset that they do not seem to notice a stranger who suddenly catches up with them and walks with them on that road. Maybe they did glance up as the stranger began to speak, but because the bright sun setting in the west blinds their eyes, they were never really able to get a good look at this man who seems to have totally missed the news of what has just occurred in that holy city. Even when the gospel tells us that he starts to chastise the two of them for their disbelief and starts to open up the scriptures for them in an amazingly revealing and familiar way, they still don't seem to pick up on just who it is who's standing there beside them. Then, as that dusty old road carries on westward past the turnoff to Emmaus, wherever Emmaus might have been, they are so amazed by what they have been hearing, they nearly let that stranger walk onward ahead of them and away from them. Only then do they stop him and they invite him, importantly, to come into their home. I still can't help but wonder how they missed what must have been the strange wounds that he was carrying on his wrists and on his palms. There the story shifts, and we are sitting at a table in the home, and the gospel reveals to us that this stranger does what will become his most important of all revelations. He takes a loaf of bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he hands it out to each of them, and instantly they finally see him for who he is. Jesus in the flesh, sitting directly in front of them. My favorite line in all the New Testament is when these two disciples look at each other in disbelief and say to one another, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us by the way and while he opened to us the scriptures?" It will be the breaking of the bread that finally unblocks their eyes and reveals who has been with them and sets their hearts on fire. Maybe that moment gave them a flashback to when Jesus broke 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 hungry seekers. Or maybe it instantly took them back to that upper room where they'd just been, where Jesus had broken bread for the Passover and declared that broken bread to be forever his body, given for each of them. Whatever it was only then they came to understand that in their darkest moment of despair, along the road headed away from Jerusalem, they had been walking and talking the entire time with the very Jesus for whom they had been in mourning for. Jesus was alive. He had truly risen from the dead, and in that incredible moment, these two disciples knew right then and there what they had to do. They were compelled to get back on that road, running, not walking this time, to get back into Jerusalem, to testify with joy and awe to what just happened to them, to all of Jesus' other disciples and followers. I will say it again. This, brothers and sisters, is the most amazing and important Easter story after the resurrection in the entire New Testament. And it is all that, even if It is only Luke's gospel and a few old Roman paving stones in the middle of a dried up riverbed today that testify all these years later to its powerful proclamation and impact on our faith. Did it really happen as the Bible tells us it did? Was there really ever a village called Emmaus? Did a man crucified on a cross, dead and buried just 3 days prior, really appear and walk beside two people, talking to them about the Holy Scriptures, breaking bread with them, and convincing them that everything that had ever been foretold before had actually already begun to take place? Well, brothers and sisters, if we were not people of faith, if we were simply trying to weigh the physical and the historical evidence, then I suppose we could only call Emmaus a good story and nothing else. But as I have said already, the story of the road to Emmaus is one of the deepest and most important components of our Christian faith. And that doesn't just speak to an event of the ancient past, but that continues to connect to all of us who today remain disciples and followers of the risen Jesus. This morning, I will be the first one to stand here and confess to you that in addition to being blessed to stand on that ancient Roman road in the Holy Land 16 years ago, I have also stood on dozens of other roads in my life that were profound evidence of the road to Emmaus. And I have been on many of those roads in life when my head has also been hung low, just like Cleopas, and when I have felt utterly defeated and alone, just like the disciple walking beside him. I have lost beloved friends and family members. I have walked on the dark road of failed relationships, shame, and divorce. I have had moments when I felt the road I was on was not just taking me away from some holy city like Jerusalem, but was also taking me away from my faith in God altogether. Times of questions, doubt, and despair. I have certainly been there more times than I want to remember this morning. But friends, I have to tell you, each and every time after I've taken a moment or two to scream or to cry or to yell or maybe even shake my fists at heaven, when I finally sat down in the silence which often follows, it's then that I've become aware of someone who is always walking along beside me. As if God was whispering in my ear directly, I've suddenly found myself remembering the story of the cross again, the sacrifice made out of unfailing love, grace, and forgiveness which I have never deserved. The bread of the Eucharist always broken and offered to me at the altar, and the sin and death which was overturned by the resurrection in order for all of us to have salvation that lasts forever and hope that is inextinguishable. And it is then, brothers and sisters, that I have realized my heart is warming inside my chest. And beyond a reasonable doubt, I know that Jesus is alive, that he is on the road to Emmaus, and that Jesus is alive now for me and for all of us who need him on the road when everything else seems to be lost. And somewhere just like me, I know you have found yourself on your own roads to Emmaus. I bet that's why you're probably here on this beautiful Sunday morning. That's why even when you feel you've fallen away, you've got going in the wrong direction on the road, you still reach out and try to follow Jesus because you have known him in the breaking of the bread. You have heard his words in the scriptures. You have recognized him walking beside you when no one else in your life could, and you've been thankful. That's the Easter gospel. That's the good news. That's what happened 2,000 years ago. And brothers and sisters, that's what is continuing to happen now because Jesus is alive. And all we need to do, like those two disciples, is stop for a moment and invite him to come into our hearts. And then once he's there and our hearts have been set on fire, to get outside, get on that road and share that good news with everyone we meet, because that, brothers and sisters, is the only thing that will save us, the only thing that will bring our world back to where it was meant to be in creation when God said it was good. Jesus gives us the hope to carry that out now and always. Amen.